Thank you very much for joining us in this cozy bomb shelter. Welcome to the event called Civilians in Captivity When the Signal Fades. My name is Sasha Dovzhik. I'm the head of Index, Institute for Documentation and Exchange, and today I am honored to chair this discussion. The title of this talk comes from an essay published in Index's online journal Narysy by one of our speakers today. Iryna Zaporozhets' father is an engineer. In 2022, when the village in the Kharkiv region was occupied by the Russian forces, Iryna's father tried to keep the connection alive. So he worked to power one of the mobile towers that transmitted the signal. It meant that as long as the generator worked, those in the occupied area could still connect to their loved ones in the free territories of Ukraine. And in early March 2022, while he was heading towards that tower to fuel it, he was surrounded by 10 armed men. He was put into an armored vehicle and he was taken away. Iryna hasn't heard from him since. This event is organized by Index, and it is organized in partnership with NGO Civilians in Captivity, which Iryna here represents. Our partners, Media Initiative for Human Rights, have provided a VR installation which you will be able to sample our discussion. This VR installation is a chance for you to experience what it is like to be in one of the cells in which Ukrainian civilians are kept in Russia. It's based on drawings by Serhiy Ofitserov. He is a civilian from Kherson, and he was sentenced to 17 years on fabricated terrorism charges. He drew this cell to preserve his sanity. So please, after this talk, come here, come closer to us, and try to wear the VR and see what it's like. We are here because people in this room, journalists and NGO professionals and human rights defenders and foundations officers, are those who have an impact where the signal about which Iryna here writes is restored, whether the signal comes back to life. Joining me today is Iryna Zaporozhets, as well as serviceman and human rights defender Maksym Butkevych, who is today representing the Center for Civil Liberties. Maksym has spent 2 years in Russian captivity, and he knows on his own experience what it is like. He also has a unique expertise as a human rights defender who had been working on this topic for years before becoming one of the prisoners of war. Also next to Maksym is Lyubov Smachilo of the Media Initiative for Human Rights. She has mapped the crisis systematically as a work of this organization. And with us also is Olesya Yaremchuk, Index's program curator, who has worked on Crimean political prisoners and whose documentary work shows us that this problem is not born in 2022. It has a much wider impact and much deeper roots. My first question will be to Iryna. As far as I understand, Russia officially denies holding your father, and he doesn't exist in their system. And I would like to know, we would all like to know what it practically means for you and for your family. You've written very persuasively about enforced disappearance as a certain mechanism, not a chance occurrence. So could you please tell us a bit more about that?
First of all, Sasha, thank you for the intro, and thank you very much all for coming here. It really warms my heart to see you all here. It's been 1,521 days since my father was abducted by Russian forces. And despite it all happened in front of my mom's eyes, she witnessed it firsthand, the Russia still denies anything. Any requests are either ignored, for example, requests from the International Committee of the Red Cross, from the European Court of Human Rights, different UN groups and bodies, or we just get some non-substantial answers from them. But I would not say that he's not in the system per se. It's just the system tries very, very hard to hide those people. And I can give you one example. Back in 2022, we were trying to find him, and we tried to use Russian messaging system for prisoners called SynPismo. And we were sending to different places, we didn't know the location. And from one of those places, we got an answer that the letter was given to the recipient. But just a few hours later, the status of the letter has changed, that the letter cannot be delivered, the recipient was moved to another location. The same thing happened several times for us at the same location, but also for other families, till eventually, probably the Russian system realized that there is a loophole, and this loophole was closed. And it means that systems just tries to hide all the information possible, doesn't want to show that those people are there. The information trickles, but in very, very small quantities and not for everybody. In our case, we got just 2 more pieces of information. One in 2022, more than half a year after the abduction, and then for 3.5 years we knew nothing. Till spring this year, where we again got another one line, just giving us hope that my dad is alive. And what it means practically, first of all, is lack of communication, both for me, for us as relatives, but also everybody who is in captivity. If a person is not confirmed by Russia through the International Committee of the Red Cross, you cannot send a letter via the Red Cross. It eventually returns back. So all this time we haven't even got a single letter from my dad. And we are not sure if he received any of the letters we are trying to send him. And from this incommunicado regime comes another consequence, is lack of protection. Russia can, in principle, do whatever they want just because they can. And how to prove that the person is there. It also has a really sizable legal consequences, both for families, for our loved ones in captivity, and for future accountability as a whole. For example, currently there is a law that intends to protect persons that deprived of personal liberty as a result of aggression. But to get that help to realize those rights, first one needs to prove that they were in captivity or their loved are in captivity. So the burden of proof is on family. If there is no information, you cannot prove that. And I ask myself, what does it mean for the fate of those we know nothing about, of thousands of people who are currently in different locations, likely in Russia, and undocumented, and we know nothing about that. What does it mean for the future accountability for all those heinous crimes? And of course, another consequence that comes with all of that is emotional burden. I cannot describe this agony, just there is a reason why Working Group on Enforced Disappearances says that the level goes to the level of torture. But if it's so hard here outside, what it must be for those there in captivity? Yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. And it's a horrible legal vacuum with no obvious instruments, with no obvious leverages. And you describe how you circle through all the organizations that are in charge of helping you and families like yours, ICRC and UN and what's not, with no result. And in your essay, you also ask what any of this practically means to your father. Do you yourself have an answer to this question?
This is a question I'm asking myself all the time, but I haven't been there. Probably Maksym has more way to answer that. I can just hypothesize, try to infer from what I see. As a relative fighting, trying to find a way, I see this huge machinery. We have all the UN organizations. We have UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearance. We have UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances. We have the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So this huge system producing a lot of the documents, a lot of the resolutions, a lot of the recommendations, including recommendations to the Russian Federation. And I'm asking, what does it mean to those now in captivity, cold, in pain, hungry? And I hope that all those documents, they are important. So if the problem is not known, we cannot solve it. So unless it doesn't exist, unless we know about it and talk about it. But those tools are probably underutilized. I will give you one example. In April 2024, there was a report, OSCE, of Moscow mechanism on questions related to detention of Ukrainian civilians by Russian Federation. It's an in-depth legal analysis, it has good conclusion, it has recommendation, and I would expect that this document would trickle around and at least professionals who deal with human rights will know it. And then about a year later, when this document was published, I was speaking at the Working Party of Human Rights in European Union Council, and I expected that everybody at least knew about the existence of this document. I was wrong. So if this document didn't trickle from Vienna to Brussels, will it trickle to a guard somewhere in a jail in the middle of nowhere in Siberia, let alone persuade them to do something differently and to at least decrease the violence and improve the conditions? There is another level where it's not general statements, it's inquiry related to a particular person, like UN, like ICRC, and they really, really hope that those help, that somebody would get the medical help they need, some conditions would improve. Even if Russia doesn't respond, even if the captive doesn't know about that, but something changes for the better. And I really hope it works, but I also know that not all people survive, and some return from the captivity dead.
Thank you so much for all your work and everything that you and your colleagues are doing to raise awareness of this problem. And I would like to mention that here with us are also two members of the NGO Civilians in Captivity. It's Kostyantin Davydenko and Oksana Dorokhova. So if you're interested in what they are ready and willing to share, please feel free to come and talk to them after the event. We are very grateful that you are here. Maksym, my next question will be for you. You had been working on precisely this issue for decades before you were captured and before you became one of the prisoners in Russia's inhumane system. Was there something that you discovered you had not known before?
Well, thank you very much in the first place for an opportunity to be here, both as a former prisoner of war and the human rights defender. I'm a member of Expert Council at the Center for Civil Liberties, and also I'm co-heading a tiny NGO, which is called the Principle of Hope, and we currently mostly focus on people in captivity and those who are released from captivity. I did not deal with the issue of captivity per se that much before 2022, although, of course, the detention places were one of the issues, and conditions in detention were one of human rights issues I was really interested in. And I was part of National Preventive Mechanism for Prevention of Torture, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment, as one of monitors visiting these places. And then by the irony of fate, I had the chance to study conditions in detention from the other side, being one of those detained. I was captured as a military person, as a serviceman, so I was prisoner of war. But of course I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know to what extent Russia ignores the international humanitarian law. So to me, it was not really that surprising that international humanitarian law is ignored, but it was surprising to what extent and how demonstrative it was. That basically it was very clear that it is not the chain of certain local incidents that the guards or interrogators they ignore the rules of war, that this is a policy, and this policy is very consistent. And sometimes it felt like ignoring international humanitarian law amounted to the stance, we will not observe it, what would you do? It's like a challenge to the whole international system. What would you do? Okay, we ignore it. We don't give a damn about it. Dare us. And at the end of the day, that was probably one of the saddest conclusions, that these actions did not meet any efficient response from international system, from international institutions. But later on, when I was in captivity, I was held as a POW for several months, and later on, to my captors, it became not sufficient to keep me as a POW. They decided to orchestrate, to fabricate a criminal case against me. At the end of the day, in 2023, I was sentenced to 13 years on fabricated charges for the war crime I never committed, of course. And they had ways of persuasion to sign self-incriminating testimony. But during this period of time, before the court verdict, I was held in the cells with both POWs and civilians. And there were some civilians in captivity who were in the same cell, whom I shared the cells with. And that really struck me, because there was a big difference. Most of these civilians, they basically just disappeared. Some of them were held without charge. They were never accused of anything. They were never charged with anything. They were not even taken to interrogations. They were just kept there. And in most cases, their relatives didn't know where they are. They basically literally disappeared. And when relatives tried to inquire on the whereabouts of their loved ones, they received an answer, we don't know. So you had no idea what happened to this person until you found yourself in the same cell, sharing the same cell with this person. And it was under so-called legislation of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic where I was held. But as far as I understand, it was carried on and on. And it was very clear that we have no idea how many of these people are in Russian detention, because we really don't know what happened to those disappeared. And I totally support and agree and sympathize with everything that Iryna said. One of the things, POWs, to make it clear, most of them, vast majority of them, are held incommunicado. They have no chance of contacting their families, their loved ones, or anyone outside of the prison. I was given a chance to have certain communication later on. When I was convicted, I was transferred to the penal colony, where I was told that you are not a prisoner of war anymore, you are just a criminal. And as a criminal, suddenly I enjoyed certain privileges. For instance, I could write letters, because POWs cannot write letters, they cannot send letters. But as a regular criminal, I could do that. Of course, not to Ukraine, but thanks to my colleagues in Russia and in other countries, I could forward certain messages. But before that, we were held incommunicado, and our interrogators made it very clear. They literally told us, no one knows where you are, no one knows what conditions you are held in. Of course, we were never visited by ICRC. We were waiting for that. We were expecting them to come. Then we stopped waiting for ICRC. Then we started to make jokes about waiting for ICRC. Like, for instance, when will you do this and this? When ICRC comes to visit us, which basically means like probably never. But we were told no one knows what conditions you are held in and where you are, which means we can do to you whatever. We can behave as we like, and we are responsible only to our commanders, and our commanders gave us free rein. So we can, this actually happened when they orchestrated a criminal case, and they explained, also by using physical pressure, my options to me. And they said, we can do to you whatever. We can kill you. We can put you in a cell with prisoners who cooperate with administration and order them to break you physically and mentally, and they will do that. If you don't sign the papers, etc., etc., and you know that we can do that. And I knew. That was very clear. So this holding incommunicado really, an absence of international monitoring of places of detention of Ukrainian both prisoners of war and civilian detainees basically means that captors can do whatever. I never experienced or felt it that way before. It gave me a very clear picture how it happens. So yeah, it was very clear. And also, I said that, I'll repeat it again, that I sympathize with Iryna, because some of the time spent in the cell, a lot of time actually, I thought about my loved ones, and I felt really awkward. I felt uncomfortable because I thought that they must be dead worried about me, and I don't have even a chance to pass a message through. Every single person in captivity's suffering should be multiplied by the number of people who worry about that person. And it is really an agony which amounts to torture. I completely support this statement. And when I finally had a chance to communicate with my loved ones, and especially when I was released from captivity, even now I cannot tell myself I know what they went through. But they went through very, very difficult time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this testimony. I think we can now move to mapping the patterns of, I can call it a crime against Ukrainian civilians held in captivity. Maksym has mentioned that it's nearly impossible to come up with a figure of how many Ukrainian citizens, civilians are there in Russian imprisonments held illegally. Lyubov, Smachilo, you have first of all mapped around 220, I think, sites where Ukrainian civilians are kept in Russia, and you have also come up with a figure of 2,047 civilians. You testified at the UN General Assembly in March, and you have mentioned that this figure in reality is probably many times higher. Could you please explain why this is so, and why actually pointing a finger at this impossibility to count is also important as evidence?
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, colleagues, for your stories and testimonies. And I would emphasize that this topic is very important, and numbers I will be talking today, it's just the cases we have identified by our organization, the Media Initiative for Human Rights. But first of all, they are higher, we know, because it's difficult to have a whole picture. And also, I agree that when we are talking about one civilian in Russian captivity, we're also talking about family, friends, colleagues, and society as a whole, because every time we're all shocked by the pictures we can see of our released prisoners of war and some civilians who were returned in Ukrainian-controlled territory. And when we see how they look after the captivity, we are all shocked. And so we're all had this impact, and it's not only about the civilians who are still in Russian captivity. So our organization, the Media Initiative for Human Rights, we started to document enforced disappearances since 2016, and with the full-scale invasion, we are put all our efforts to conducting in-depth interviews with victims of enforced disappearances in liberated territories of Ukraine. We had and we are continuing to do field missions to these territories and interviewing victims and relatives of those who were detained in these territories, and we are also monitoring open source information to have more information about those who were arrested in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and then transferred to the places of detention in the Russian Federation. And we are also doing in-depth interviews with released prisoners of war, because, as Maksym already mentioned, usually civilians, they are kept together with prisoners of war, so we can have names, information about civilians who are still in Russian detention. And we created a map where we had today 240 places of detention. So it's the occupied territories of Ukraine, Russian Federation, and 2 places of detention in Belarus, because civilians from northern regions of Ukraine were transferred to the Russian Federation through Belarus, and they were detained for several days there. It's difficult for us to have concrete numbers. Now we have 2,500 cases so civilians who are in Russian captivity, but overall we know about 4,044 cases of detention. So some of them were released in the first months of occupation, some of them were returned together with prisoners of war. We know also cases of people who were killed while in detention. For us, it's difficult to have a whole picture because we're still having 19% of Ukrainian territory under Russian occupation, so we don't have access to these territories. We can conduct a field mission or something. We can only have some contacts with the relatives who are still in these territories, but usually for their safety, we try not to communicate with them from Ukrainian-controlled territory. So we are trying to do some scene investigation and to have information also about these cases of unlawful detention in the temporarily occupied territories. And also another problem is that we have cases, for example, of civilians who were detained in temporarily occupied territories and they were released in temporarily occupied territories, and we usually, it's difficult to count also these cases. Then one other source of information is this trials Russian Federation started against civilians in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and Russian Federation. And yes, we are trying also, our organization is doing this monitoring actually of all these trials, and we are trying to have also some numbers, new names, and about civilians who remain in Russian detention. About why it is also a part of crime to hide these names of civilians. So first of all, under international humanitarian law, Russian Federation actually can arrest civilians in some cases, but under several conditions. And we see, and also Moscow Mechanism report, other international organizations already mentioned that none of these conditions were respected by the Russian Federation. So we can say that these civilians, most of the cases are cases of enforced disappearances or unlawful detention of these people. And I think that Russian Federation is doing this for several reasons. First of all, to hide their violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Second, because they are holding these people incommunicado without any connections with their families or outside world, which means that these people are exhausted and they put a lot of psychological pressure on them, and then they can charge whatever they want and try them in Russian so-called courts. Also because it helps Russian Federation to control temporarily occupied territories and population there, because people they are living this atmosphere of fear, and they know if they will be arrested for their pro-Ukrainian views or their opposition to the occupation, they can be in these places of detention for 5 or more years without any communication with the outside world.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Media Initiative for Human Rights for all your work, and for the fact that we have these numbers and that you commit to this absolutely grinding labor of documenting and trying to trace the names and the numbers and the roots. I want to share how I first learned about Maksym's work. It was back in 2018 when I realized that there was a man on TV with whom we wear similar t-shirts, and it was a black t-shirt with the motto "Free Sentsov and Kolchenko," and with the 2 profiles in white of Ukrainian film director Oleg Sentsov and his colleague activist Alexander Kolchenko, and those were Ukrainian civilians from Crimea who were kidnapped when Russia occupied the peninsula, and they were held in Russia illegally for years. Oleg Sentsov is currently fighting in the Ukrainian armed forces. But I'm telling this story just to illustrate how far back this problem goes. It didn't just appear in 2022. Ukrainian civilians have been in Russian captivity for almost a decade, and they have atrocious prison terms, some of them. Our colleague Olesya Yaremchuk is working, is documenting the imprisonment of Crimean journalists. And through your work, Olesya, for Free Voices of Crimea, the book that you're currently holding, you are telling the stories of 16 Crimean journalists who have been imprisoned in Russia. And for those who think that this problem was born in 2022, what does this record from Crimea show?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for your kind words. Actually, I think that after occupation of Crimea, there was a huge attention to this topic about political prisoners, because mostly people were detained in 2014, 16, and so on. But after that, I think because of other problems which we had in Ukraine, I think that this topic was like behind the glass wall. So we still knew that people are detained, that there are people in Russian prison, in Russian prisons. But in my opinion, we should have do more to help free them. And actually, I'm not a human rights activist. I'm an author who specializes on the topic of national communities and indigenous people. And coming to this book was my main interest in the history of indigenous people and national communities, because mostly people in Crimea are imprisoned, who are imprisoned, political prisoners, are Crimean Tatars. So as I know, the last data which we have, the Department of President in Crimea, 223 people which we have political prisoners of Crimea, 133 are Crimean Tatars. So for me it was personally important to show their cases, but not only Crimean Tatars, of course. And actually your case, Maksym, was also in our list, but later because of this informational cap and the category that you are like a military person who is not in the list of political prisoners. So we haven't a chance to publish this in this book, but still it was important for us. I mean, we had a huge team, PEN Ukraine, the Ukrainians online journal, and Human Rights Center Zmina. We all collected data on this topic and prepared this book. At the beginning it was a media project published by the Ukrainians magazine, and then it was published in Ukrainian, in English language, in Vivat Publishing House. So we depicted stories of 16 political prisoners, journalists who are in Russian prisoners. And the problem was that, as you mentioned, like that after the occupation, we had a lot of materials about that, but later there was a lack of information, I would say. And thanks to the work and a huge database of Human Rights Center Zmina, we had this access to the letters, to the contacts of relatives, of like friends of those people. But still, for me as a reporter, it was a huge challenge to work on this topic, because the only way how I can contact those people are via letters, via this platform Zona Telecom. And I learned to write in Russian language, to send some messages to those political prisoners. For example, I wrote to Nariman Jalal, who was in Krasnodarsky Krai, and to Asan Akhtem, who were detained of the fabricated charges, as well as all those 16 people, stories of which we depict in this book. And answering your question, I think it's a huge mistake to forget that these cases, they didn't start in 2022. Of course, after the occupation, after 2014, there were cases where people, like normal civilians, when they were abducted, when they disappeared, and relatives also tried to find a way to contact them. It could be in CISO, sorry, I forgot the detention center, or later in the other prisons across the huge Russian territory. For me personally, it's a huge responsibility to have a chance to talk about them, to remind their stories, because as I mentioned, I think we all forgot about those cases because we have another problems. But when I communicate with those people, with their relatives, for example, as a mother, I also understand that all those wives which we interviewed, they raise children, for example, 4 children in the family, they raise their children without father for 10 years. And it's a really hard topic to speak, and I think we should do more to help them free.
Yeah. absolutely. Another follow-up question from me. So you have no easy access to these prisoners. How do you, as a journalist, write them into existence while Russia does its best for them to disappear? You don't have this usual channel as a reporter to sit down and talk. What would be your advice?
Thank you so much for this question. As I mentioned, it was a huge challenge for me, and actually it was the first time, because I am a reporter. I always say we should go to the field, we should interview people. We cannot write about something without talking to this person. But like this request was this request broke all our rules, because I understood it's better to write in different way, to interview other people, to tell their stories. As I mentioned, thanks to Human Rights Center Zmina, we had this database with letters, with courtman statements, with contacts of relatives and friends and lawyers, and also we involved a lot of experts in the human rights field. So we tried to show their cases through different voices. And mostly for me, personally, it was a great chance to talk to the wives, because they can tell a lot. And it was also a huge challenge to write this book without mentioning any word as a war, occupation, or something like that, because we all knew that if it will be in this book, and in Crimea it will be considered as a terrorist peace and so on, it could be dangerous for those people who we interview. So we tried to. So for I, as an author, I can write such words as a war occupation, but in all quotes and all information which we had from our interviewees, we these words are changed to events of 2014 or something like that. So we had to change this linguistic statement as well. And in some cases, I hadn't chance to talk to anyone, at all. For example, relatives are not responding; they are not in the contact. So the only way to show their stories were letters, human rights activists, friends, lawyers, and this database which Human Rights Center Zmina had. But still, it's the only way to talk about them. And if we have a chance to write letters to them, I think it's a huge opportunity to remind that we are in the contact, that we are remembering that you are still here. Because from this personal perspective, I also heard from Nariman Jalal, who was released, and later with Ukrainian media we I filmed a story about him. For him, it was really important to hear and to know that somebody is thinking about you. That's why I use this chance to promote the opportunity that all of you can write a letter via this platform, which I think Media Initiative for Human Rights, you have also this opportunity to send letters. Human Rights Center Zmina, they have these forms. It's really important to write to them, so they know that they are not forgotten. Yeah.
It's really important to write to them. It's also really important to write about them. And Maksym, you have mentioned that you have come up with recommendations on how to write informative pieces about political prisoners who to whom we don't have this easy access without being sensationalist or without re-traumatizing maybe their families and their loved ones. For the audience of media practitioners whom we do hope will pay attention to this topic, could you please share some of those recommendations?
Thank you. In the first place, it is important to write about them and to talk about them. When I was released from captivity, my friends and my colleagues and my loved ones, they asked me, what is the most important thing to remember when you are in captivity, to know, to think about? And the most important thing is to know that you are not forgotten. This is very important to know, that there are people out there who think about you, who talk about you, who transfer information about you, who discuss your plight. And this is why when I was released, together with my colleagues, we developed visual symbols of solidarity with prisoners of war and civilian detainees. I'm wearing it on my t-shirt now, and later on, if you are interested, you can pick up them on sticker bags, which are positioned there next to VR equipment. This is to make it visible in our common space that we think about people in captivity. And this is why it is really important to create media materials, both about those who are still in captivity and about those who are released and who share their stories. But unfortunately, of course, we come across from time to time media pieces which try to combine interest in the topic with certain sensationalism, and it's not that it's like non-stylish or even bad journalism. In the first place, it can be dangerous. So do no harm is the principle number one. Do no harm. If you interview a person who is released from captivity, it is important to think how not to re-traumatize this person. It doesn't mean that you should not ask questions about captivity, because this is why these questions should be asked, but how you ask them. And also, every person, every unique human being has much more than just experience of captivity. So to position someone just as a former detainee and nothing else is kind of derogatory, is degrading. Then, of course, there is a risk of doing harm to relatives, especially if they stay in the occupied territories. And the third, to those ones who are still in captivity. Because mentioning the conditions, we unfortunately know the cases when people were interviewed after being released from captivity, and they talked about their fresh experiences in certain particular detention place. And Russians know straight away that this interview was broadcasted, and they come to those who are still held in captivity and say, you know, your brother-in-arms said that you are mistreated here. You don't know what mistreated is. Now we'll show you what real mistreatment looks like. So these things should be kept in mind, but in the first place, it is about doing no harm and about respect towards human dignity of those who are still in captivity and those who are released. Me and my colleagues, we don't try to make ourselves like super experts in this field, but I am a journalist myself. I dedicated more than 10 years of my life to journalism. And we created this sort of recommendations to journalists who would like to cover the topic of captivity. They're also available there in Ukrainian. We didn't publish it in English yet. In English, it will be available online, but in Ukrainian also next to sticker packs. Those who are interested, you can pick them up.
Thank you so much. I encourage everyone in the audience to browse the materials and wear the VR glasses. A final question for me, and then we'll turn to the audience. So we know that the Geneva Conventions do not specify any mechanism for releasing illegally imprisoned civilians. We know that the ICRC doesn't have any access to them. We have described this terrible legal vacuum that exists around them, and we have described the sort of lack of international response currently, which this situation currently requires. So this is my question to all the speakers. If you were to design this international response from scratch, how would it look?
This is a kind of a question. Yeah, in the first place, because, well, civilians should not be in captivity in the first place. They should not be there. This is another huge difference between civilian detainees and prisoners of war. There are rules about detaining prisoners of war, but there are no rules about detaining civilians on fabricated charges or who are just disappeared. But what I really would like to see in any international system, whatever it would look like, is independent international monitoring mechanism of the places of detention. This is number one, because as I mentioned before, lack or absence of independent monitoring basically gives free hand to captors to mistreat the prisoners, detainees, and to do whatever they like to them. And of course, there should be strong international reaction to all cases of detaining civilians, including sanctions, including personal sanctions. I think there are a lot of things still to be done in this particular field, and it should be made stronger. Although I should say that in general, if it is possible to come up with an idea how to create a system which would enforce the rights of civilian detainees to be observed, it's still a big question to me.
I do agree that we have mechanisms because it's forbidden to detain these civilians. This is a mechanism. We don't need to have mechanisms to release them because we don't need to detain them. I think that the good news that we can be more creative on our strategy how to advocate the release of these people, and we are not in the frame of some instructions step by step. For instance, for example, we have only ICRC who can have access to these places of detention, and we have problems with this because no other international organization can demand for this access, and we are struggling with this. So here we have opposite story. We have different kind of advocacy that we can use to advocate the release of civilians. In the Media Initiative for Human Rights, we're trying to do public campaigns on the release of civilians. We're trying to advocate cases where we have families who are standing with us to advocate the release of their loved ones. And we have also some quiet advocacy that we're using in sensitive cases. We are trying also this virtual reality experience to show the condition of detention. All these tools we are using, I think that make it public to have personal sanctions on those who are torturing in these places of detention can be helpful. And then, yes, to advocate this issue in different countries. We're also trying to group the civilians by their profession, age, health condition, and then trying to involve, for example, professional association in different countries to help us to advocate the release of this group of people, take some cases. But I still believe that all these reports that we are having from different international organizations, Moscow mechanism, will be helpful for the accountability and for justice.
I think my answer would be really short. I think that in this legal language we should accept the reality of war. And of course we know that civilians in general, they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be captivated. So on the international level, it should be accepted as a reality of war, and then to find an instrument, legal instrument, how to have a database on those people, how to deal with those people who are in this incommunicado format, yeah, so we have access to them.
Thank you. Iryna?
Oh, it's hard to answer. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be here. But first of all, I really tend to dislike formulation mechanism to release civilians. As was already said, they should not be there at all. So the mechanism is simple. You just take a bus, put all of them on the bus, and bring them home. The problem is that the Russian Federation doesn't allow it, even though it should, under all the obligation, Fourth Geneva Convention, Third Geneva Convention, there are millions of them. So the real problem is how to enforce what we have now. So sanctions were already mentioned, but as far as I know, so far there were no personal sanctions or warrants regarding to unlawfully detained civilians. It should not take that much time. It should not take years to put economic pressure, to put diplomatic pressure. Why are we still debating to include or exclude Russian representatives from certain organizations after all of these war crimes and crimes against humanity? So first should be accountability mechanism that is written directly and doesn't depend on political will. And I would also say that how currently organization functions, ICRC was already mentioned, UN bodies, they are very rigid and they are very unreactive. For example, there is a group on arbitrary detentions. I personally wrote a complaint in February 2023. I haven't heard an answer from them. And they only make about up to 90 statements every year. And we are talking about thousands. If we look at ICRC, it's always difficult to communicate with them, but when you open their statute, the language is to endeavor to ensure that international humanitarian law is upheld. Not to ensure, just to endeavor to ensure. So their answer is always, we tried, we cannot, that's all we can do. That's been for years now. So increasing those mandates, making them more flexible would be another change. And also at the end of the day, I don't care that Russia is not a signature, didn't sign the Convention of Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Ukraine has ratified it. They came to our house, took my dad on Ukrainian soil. I don't care they don't sign that convention. That happened in Ukraine. So also, it should not matter that Russia doesn't recognize European Court for Human Rights anymore, European Convention Against Torture. They should be held accountable, and there should be real consequences. I believe and I still hope that this is possible, but this requires political will. And to get this political will, that's where in democratic society we need power of community, we need power of all of you. So please talk about it, spread this information. If you can find politicians who are interested, for example, to support some of the cases, to raise public awareness, that would be fantastic, and that's something that would immensely help and maybe save somebody's life.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions in this structured environment and then we'll proceed. So the first question here.
Nikolai Klemenuk, Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung from Germany. So about a year ago, there was a film produced by a Russian human rights initiative, Aquatica, that was devoted to the Ukrainian civilian prisoners in Russian captivity. And their estimate of the number of such prisoners was about 20,000 people. So my first question is, what do you think of this estimate? And then another thing is kind of suggesting that Russian lawyers and Russian human rights activists were in some ways instrumental in establishing contacts and determining if people are in captivity. So is there any cooperation with Russians? How important is this cooperation in finding people? And what do you think about this film in general? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Iryna has noted, so she is at least aware of its existence.
I'm aware, and one of the stories featured in that film is the story of my dad. As already said, it's hard to estimate the total number. So 16,000, 20,000 is often based on estimate of the Office of Ombudsman in Ukraine. We don't know. It's an estimate based on the number of missing people. Some of them are likely in captivity, some of them dead, likely, we don't know. So it's really hard to put a right number on that. But I would say, I would assume that if we don't know that the person is dead, for sure, then we assume that person is alive. And if that person is alive, then it's somewhere. And in terms of collaboration or cooperation, let's not use collaboration in that term, too heavily charged. It's also a very difficult topic. There are different people. Of course, they represent a country that is our direct enemy now, that attacked us. But some of them did quite a lot, and some of them put their freedom on the line while doing that. Because for representing Ukrainians charged with terrorism, extremism, whatever, lawyers there risk their own freedom and their own life sometimes. So that would be my answer to that.
Next question.
Petralma from Belgium. I run an informal network group with several officials and human rights activists. I am wondering, if you look to the future, although the alarms would not say it, the Russian president says that the war is ending. Well, we don't believe it, maybe necessarily. I definitely would not believe his words. But if you look at prisoners of war, do you think the 5 people or the 4 people in this debate that the European Union is well informed enough about the necessity to get it in any kind of peace negotiations? And is there not a need of a central figure within the Ukrainian political system who would first of all negotiate with the European Union if there are peace negotiations, that this return of prisoners is a bigger priority in possible peace negotiations? Thank you very much.
I think that people are priority. We're usually talking about children, deported children, civilian detainees and prisoners of war, exchange of all prisoners, all to all. But I think that it's one of priorities, but as human rights defenders and two coalitions of Ukrainian NGOs, we're all advocating that returning of our people home is the main priority in this peace negotiation. And basically it's our work to advocate this priority. This would be my answer.
To what extent it is of crucial importance to decision makers in the European Union is a question to me. So far, at least in most cases, we know Ukrainian representatives at different stages of, I don't really even like to use the word negotiations, because there were no negotiations. There were sort of preparational stages to possible, at some point, negotiations. But Ukrainian representatives made it clear when there were talks in the Middle East, etc., that mutual release of those who are held in captivity is a priority, one of top 3 priorities. And basically, so far, the only results of these negotiations, or whatever they are, were exchanges within which of anything else. But to what extent it is a part of a larger framework for possible peace talks in the future, shared by all actors, I don't know. To me, it's a big question. So far, it looks like Ukraine consistently demonstrated that it is a priority to Ukraine. I don't know. I do not feel knowledgeable enough to say about the European Union. The stance of the United States is even more less clear on many points, including this one. So it is a difficult question. But to me, it is important that Ukrainian side at least demonstrates consistently that it is a priority. I really hope it will be so in the future.
Also regarding civilian prisoners.
Yes, exactly. Also regarding civilian prisoners.
Probably like to add to that, that's a really great question. And I write in an essay that the problem of civilians is often somewhat lost in translations. It's often discussed together with prisoners of war, and it shares a lot of commonalities when it comes to human rights, but this need for a separate way to release civilians often gets lost. And unfortunately, the resources of Ukraine are stretched thin. There are a lot of other things, so probably the diplomatic staff doesn't pay enough attention. They should probably pay a little bit more attention to this question that currently is. And I've had quite some experience with Ukrainian diplomats in different countries that probably saw that level of awareness is lower than we as a families would like it to be. Now there is a new position within Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that would specifically deal with prisoners of war and civilian detainees and missing persons. So we would hope that this designated person would work more and level of awareness will increase. But you are absolutely right, we hear a lot about territories. We don't hear enough about people.
In that case, I think we are ready for the VR experience, and we are also ready to thank our partners, Civilians in Captivity, Media Initiative for Human Rights, Center for Civil Liberties. We are Index. We are running this event as part of the Lviv Media Forum. Thank you so much for hosting us in this program, and thank all of you for coming and for listening to this important and not an easy conversation. I hope you will carry on the message, and I hope that you will follow the work of these fantastic speakers. Iryna Zaporozhets, Olesa Yaремчук, Любов Смачило, Maksym Butkevych, from whom you'll have a chance to hear tomorrow because he is the keynote speaker at the Lviv Media Forum. Thank you so much. Thank you.